I think that if there are a couple of things that unite us across this House, is that we do all believe in fair play. We do all believe in an honest day's pay for an honest day's work. But the reality is that millions of workers in this country are simply not earning their fair share of the wealth that we produce together. The reality is that if wages, labour income, was the same share of national income as it was back in the 1950s, there would be something like £12,000 a year going into pay packets for every single one of the 33.8 million workers in this country. And so after we've had this decade that has seen 4 million people trapped in low pay, after a decade in which we have had a living standards crisis, it behoves each and every one of us to think more creative and more constructively about how we support workers in this economy earn a good life for them and their family. Now, on our committee, we had the privilege of hearing from some of the best employers in the country, but we also had the duty to interrogate many of those firms which, frankly, were letting down our country. And I just want to highlight 3 examples to light up some of the amendments that are down in my name and the names of honourable and right honourable members, because these are not amendments that I wish to put to the vote, but they are amendments which are probing amendments and on which I think the Minister needs to provide the House with some answers. Let me just start with McDonalds, because I referenced that in an earlier intervention. This is one of the most significant employers in our country. It employs over 200,000 people. 90% of workers in McDonald's are on 0 hours contracts. And it was the BBC investigation, indeed Zoe Conway, the employment correspondent, who on the day of our hearing exposed the reality that hundreds of McDonald's employees were contacting the BBC and the EHRC with allegations of the most appalling harassment. Indeed, we heard the case of a 17-year-old worker for McDonald's who alleged that she was being asked for sex in return for a manager giving her the shifts that they want. How on earth can that be acceptable in today's economy? And yet when we put this point to the chief executive of McDonald's and said, do you think that the imbalance of power that has flourished in McDonald's because of 90% of your workers being on 0 hours contracts has anything to do with this litany of abuse, has anything to do with 700 workers contacting their solicitors to bring a case against McDonald's? The answer was no. Absolutely extraordinary denial of the reality. Second, we then heard from Evri. Evri, as many people know, one of the most significant courier firms in this country, employs tens of thousands of people. Mr. Hugo Martin came before our committee to give evidence and told the committee that all at Evri was sweetness and light. We have now received, as a committee, hundreds upon hundreds of complaints from whistleblowers alleging the way that they are cheated and undercut, most recently through the rate cuts, the packet racket, which is still persisting, health and safety abuses at work, intimidation, bullying, harassment, being told time and time again that their shifts will be cut or they will be out the door if they don't work 6 days a week. This is just completely unacceptable behaviour that is happening to our constituents. And then, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, and here I must be careful of scope, but then, of course, we heard from the company Shein, who couldn't even tell the committee whether the products that they made contained cotton in China. We were simply trying to understand whether workers in our country are being undercut by abuse of modern slavery practices abroad. And so I say to the House that although we may have our differences about this bill, we have got to accept the reality that for millions of people in this country, for millions of the people that we are sent to this House to represent, they are being treated in a way that should be unacceptable in a 21st century economy. And of course, what the good employers said to our committee, time and time again, is that actually they supported the spirit of this legislation. Of course, there were concerns about the detail, and it's good that the Minister has listened. But what they did not want to see persist is a situation that they feared, which is that the good firms are being undercut by the bad. We've got to have a level playing field in this country. That is going to be a necessity if we're going to win a global race to the top. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, Amendments 275 and to 277 in my name actually suggest some amendments to the 0 hours regime that the Minister has set out. Actually, I think that we should be abolishing the definitions of low hours in the contracts. I accept the evidence that was given to us by Paddy Lewis, a brilliant General Secretary of USDOR, that keeping that definition of low hours in the contract actually creates the risk of loopholes that will be exploited by bad employers. And then amendments 278 to 281 are what you might call the McDonalds amendments. So these are amendments that basically urge the Minister to put on the face of the bill a definition of what is reasonable notice, to move shifts, to put on the face of the bill the compensation that should be entailed if there are unreasonable moves in shifts. Because we need to make sure that our workers in this country, particularly young workers, are never again open to the kind of abuse that we have seen unfold at McDonald's. Those days must be consigned to the past. New Clause 80 is what you might then call the Evri Amendment. That creates an obligation, a duty on the Minister to bring before this House within 6 months of this bill the finalisation of a review of single status of workers. We heard compelling evidence from the Director of Labour Market Enforcement, who said to us that the government, ministers, civil servants could consult, in her words, until the cows came home. We could put this consultation about the different kinds of definition of worker off forever and a day. And actually, what we need to do is end the kind of abuse that we see at Evri now. And so making sure that these loopholes are closed, so that bogus self-employment is no longer a loophole through which bad employers abuse honest workers in this country. That's a requirement that I would like to see the Minister step up to. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, New Clause 81 is what you might call the Shein Amendment. And this requires the government to update the Modern Slavery Act, in particular Section 54, to ensure that the employment rights which are granted in this bill are not simply undermined by companies operating in this country which are abusing modern slavery legislation. At the time, the Modern Slavery Act was world-leading legislation, but now we heard clear evidence from companies like Tesco's that this country was at risk, in their words, of becoming a dumping ground of bad products produced by workers exploited abroad. We cannot have a situation where this country that led the abolition of slavery is now a country where we have second-class protections against modern slavery in the 21st century. That is not something that we should permit, and so I would welcome a commitment from the Minister as to when the Modern Slavery Act is going to be updated. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, we welcomed some of the amendments that the Minister has brought forward, in particular the enhanced protection for agency workers and action on umbrella companies. Those were both recommendations which we carried in an excellent report, our report from the Select Committee to the House, which I commend to all members. But I hope from this debate we can salvage some consensus. This bill is going to go through today. This will be the biggest overhaul of employment rights in this country. We've got to make sure that it is something that lasts for the future. And the more that we can do to bring a cross-party consensus around that simple idea that every worker, every constituent in this country should have the right, the power, the freedom to earn a good life for them and their family. The sooner we bring that consensus, the better.